Hi, welcome back to PLS 101, American Democracy and Citizenship. In this session, we're going to continue our discussion of Congress and particularly talk about how a bill becomes a law, talk about the different nuances and processes involved as part of that. And then we're also going to talk about the increasing role that members of congressional staffs play to help the members of Congress and some of the things that they do and what that might also imply in terms of the power of Congress. If you remember back, talking about how a bill becomes a law, if you remember back, everyone thinks about the days when they were maybe in elementary school and they saw the Schoolhouse Rock video about how I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill. And you can even today, it's amazing, you can go on YouTube and put in Schoolhouse Rock bill and you'll see that. So as your homework, you might want to do that. Because I want you to see the contrast between what you were learning way back then, perhaps on Schoolhouse Rock, and what you're going to hear right now. It's a lot of difference between the two in terms of the complexity. Although it was not to say that the Schoolhouse Rock isn't accurate, because there are a lot of aspects about that we're doing it, but it's obviously pretty superficial. Nonetheless, fun to watch, so I'd encourage you to go and check out the YouTube on that. Let me tell you first of all, in terms of how a bill becomes a law, the complexity of the procedure makes it very hard to pass a bill. There's no question about that. There are all these obstacles along the way. There are numerous points in the process in which a bill can be blocked and thus prevented from becoming a law. And it is no wonder that far more bills get introduced than those that make it into law. Now let me tell you, go back to the point I made in the last session on Congress when I was talking about how congressional sessions run every 2 years. All right, you'll have an election in an even year in November. All right. And then that even year, then the very, very next January in the odd year, that's when the next congressional session begins. And that session will run from January of that odd year through the following December of the following even year. All right, so for example, if you have a congressional election in November of 2010, then in January of 2011, that congressional session will last from January of 2011 till December of 2012. Okay, so that's how that works. Now, 2 years is a short period of time, and that basically means, and then again, that 2-year session applies to both the Senate and the House. As we've talked about before, the entire House of Representatives goes up for re-election every 2 years. A third of the Senate goes up for re-election every 2 years, since that body serves 6-year terms. So, you've got 2 years to get something done, 2 years to get legislation through, all right? Now, and because of that, you may work tirelessly on some legislation only to see that it just gets, sort of bashed upon the rocks of failure because because of these obstacles that prevent it from coming up for a vote. Now, any member of Congress can introduce a bill, and that bill is assigned a number. If it never passes, if that bill never passes, it has to be reintroduced. I mean, it doesn't have to be, but it can be reintroduced the next session. Let's say, for example, that if you have a bill that is voted down or the president vetoes or something like that, you just simply can't, during that same session, go and reintroduce this bill and hope for a better outcome the second time. But instead, you have to wait for that session to be over, and it can only be reintroduced during the next session or some form of that. The president cannot introduce bills in Congress, but the president can, or someone in the executive branch can draft a bill, but it can only be introduced by a member of Congress. Okay. Now, after the bill is introduced and assigned a number, it's referred to a committee, one of those standing committees or subcommittees that we were talking about during our last session. Bills that involve revenue or appropriations, that is money, generally originate in the House of Representatives. Now, the thing that I like to talk about in terms of bills, oftentimes I think about this, is a graveyard. I think of committees as the graveyard of bills, because most bills will die in committee. Most bills, once they go into committee, will never see the light of day. Others may be assigned a subcommittee to a subcommittee, and again, it's deliberated on. Now, let me tell you what happens once the bill goes to a committee or a subcommittee. What begins to happen to this? They don't just kill the bill, obviously, but what begins to happen here is that once it's assigned to a committee or a subcommittee, research is done on the bill. The bill is researched on, studied upon, marked up, is the term that's used, amended, modified, worked on, if you will. All right. And as part of this process, members of Congress might hold hearings on a particular bill. They might invite members of the public to speak or members of interest groups to speak. And this is where interest groups, again, can play a very important role here in terms of influencing the outcomes of bills, where they're asked to testify before Congress on maybe some gun control legislation. Maybe members of the NRA will come before a Senate subcommittee. So the things, when you see, for example, turning on C-SPAN and you see members in a committee deliberating on bills or people testifying before Congress, this is often what's going on. They're in the process of considering legislation that deals with a particular area. So you're looking at this. You also have members of Congress are gathering additional evidence for consideration as part of trying to make the best bill possible. Now again, the committee chairs here can play a very important role. They can exert a significant influence. A bill which is assigned to a committee with a chair who opposes a bill, kind of the idea I was talking about before in the last session with the speaker assigning a bill to a committee with a chair who opposes a particular bill, well, that bill will probably never make it out of committee, all right? But in any case, the chairs can play a major role in influencing the shape and the form of the bill and even whether or not that bill even makes it out of committee. Now, if there are hearings that are being held as part of the deliberations on the bill, they're being used to inform members of Congress who are on that committee what the proposed legislation is all about. And like I said, it may give interest groups a great chance to speak out and even build support for a measure. Many times members of congressional staffs, these people who work for members of Congress, they will prepare specific questions to give their members of Congress to ask questions at a hearing. And again, members of congressional staffs will also do further research on these particular bills that are being considered. Now, once hearings are being held or after they've been held, the committee or the subcommittee will make revisions and additions to the bill. The committee or subcommittee at that point will then vote on whether to report the bill out of the committee or the subcommittee, all right? And then if it's voted out of the subcommittee to the committee as a whole, more hearings may be held, more evidence is gathered, further markup may be taking place by members of the committee. The committee at that point then may decide to vote the bill out of committee and basically report it to the House or Senate floor, whether it's we're talking about the House or the Senate committee. They will vote to report it out to that floor of that body. If a majority of the committee members approve to vote it to the floor, it will be placed on the calendar for consideration. So then at that point it will come up for a vote on the floor. Now in the Senate, a bill can be considered at any time when it comes out of committee. It can be considered at any time whenever a majority of the Senate approves it, of the committee members. Now in the House you have a little bit different situation. You have what's called a Rules Committee. And that Rules Committee is very, very powerful because it sets the terms by which a particular bill will be considered. For example, how many amendments may be allowed from the floor, or how much time for debate on the bill as a whole, and for each amendment that may be proposed. So there are more specific restrictions placed upon bills that are going up and can be considered on the House floor, whereas a much more freer kind of atmosphere on the Senate floor. But in any case, once a bill reaches the floor, be it the House or the Senate, that bill is going to be debated by members of the Senate as a whole or members of the House as a whole. While debate, again, tends to be much more restricted in the House, it's much more freer in the Senate because of the way they have their rules. And in the Senate, unlike the House, you can, for example, filibuster a bill. The process of filibustering is to basically talk a bill to death. You're giving lengthy speeches to prevent votes from being taken on the bill. And essentially, that filibuster can be effective unless a 3/5 majority of the Senate, that is 60 people, vote to agree to end debate in the filibuster. That's called cloture. Cloture ends the filibuster, and that takes a 3/5 majority to end the filibuster. Now, in the Senate, you can add a lot of amendments to the bill, and these are called riders. They may be very unrelated to the bill itself. I mean, let me give you just an example. There could be a bill that's being considered that authorizes funding for the Defense Department for the next fiscal year. There might be a rider that's introduced that provides, this is unlikely, but this could happen, expansion of free lunch programs for children in need here in the United States. What does free lunch programs have to do with this defense policy? Nothing. But the point here is that members of the Senate can introduce relatively unrelated amendments to that bill and be proposed, and they'll vote, and the Senate will vote on these amendments. And if they are approved, then that becomes part of the bill. Now, members of the House can do the same thing, but there are, again, more restrictions on how the number of amendments that can be introduced or proposed because of the House Rules Committee. In any case, all right, so you have debate on the floor of the House or the Senate. In any case, as they're being debated, amendments are being considered and proposed and voted on. And in any case, finally, if a bill passes, once all the amendments have been considered, and this is now the bill that we're going to be voting upon as a whole, if the bill passes the House or the Senate in different forms, you have to create a conference committee. But even before you do that, let me again just show you. Let's say you're in the House and you debated upon the bill on the floor, all right? It's got all these different amendments to the bill. Finally, the House, at any point in time, could vote against the bill. But let's say if it makes it out of the House, okay, it's gotten this far, then it's got to go to the other bodies, in this case the Senate. It has to go to the Senate, and guess what happens? The same process begins. So you've now had this House bill with all these modifications to it that's now going to the Senate, where again it's going to go through the whole committee process. It's going to be introduced into a committee and or subcommittees. Further hearings may be held, further additional evidence may be considered, further markup. And even at that point, members of the Senate may say, we're not going to vote this bill out of committee. All right? It may not even get out of a subcommittee. It's dead. If it never gets out of that far, it's dead. All that work in the House all of a sudden becomes for naught because of the fact that the Senate did not take action on it. It never made it out of subcommittee, or it never made it out of committee. But again, let's say that it makes it out of committee. All right? Now, the committee version of that bill may have further amendments and changes to it. Okay, so already we see a very, very different bill forming than what was in the House version that was finally passed. Now, the Senate committee version of the bill has to go before the entire Senate floor. So again, the same process occurs, more debate ensues, maybe even at that point more hearings could be held, who knows? But in any case, more amendments may be proposed, more riders, i.e. amendments, may be attached to that Senate bill, and a vote could be taken. And once the Senate votes as a whole on that particular amended, modified bill, the Senate may vote against the bill. And then what happens? The bill is dead. Let's say at this point that it finally makes it out of the Senate. So here we now have a vote, a bill that made it tortuously out of the House, got into the Senate, went through this torturous process and comes out of the Senate too. Chances are now you've got a House version of that bill and a Senate version of that bill, and so you've got two different forms, and so therefore you have to create a conference committee, again, made of members of both houses with key actors or players who played a role in the formation and modification of those bills, those who have a big stake in the outcomes of these bills. Now, they're going to iron these differences out. That's the purpose of the conference committee. And the members are often picked by chairs of the standing committees that handled the major pieces of that proposed legislation. Once these differences are ironed out, and by the way, they may not get ironed out, and if they don't get ironed out, then the bill dies. But let's say that they are both ironed out. So now you have a third hybrid of the first two. All right, so now you've got, in a lot of ways, a different bill. It's got elements of the House version, elements of the Senate version, but now here is the bill. All right, now you see how different that bill was when it first started out, when it was first introduced in the House, way back when? And we're talking about, you've got a 2-year time frame. And you may find that your time is ticking, the clock is ticking, and you're running out of time to get this thing done. Now, once these differences are ironed out, though, in the conference committee, they are then sent back to the House and the Senate. In this case here, they don't then treat this as a brand new bill and go through the process all again. Heavens no. Thank goodness no. It would take forever for legislation to get approved. But instead, what has to happen is that the House and the Senate both have to approve the conference committee report. All right? They have to approve what the conference committee did. If one house or the other does not approve the conference committee report, what happens? Of course, as you know now, the story is the same, the bill dies. Let's say that both houses approve the conference committee report. Wow, okay, finally, that bill has made it out of Capitol Hill. That bill then finally goes to the president for his signature. And of course, if the president doesn't like the bill, the president can veto the bill. If the president vetoes the bill, what happens? That bill will probably die. The president's veto is a very, very powerful instrument that he has used, and essentially, I think historically about 96% of his vetoes, or the president's vetoes, have stood. In other words, only about 4% are overridden. But let's just say this right now, though. The president does veto that bill. It can go back to Congress, and Congress could technically override that bill with 2/3 majority in both houses. Now, if that bill only had a bare majority in both houses, it's hard to muster a 2/3 majority to override that bill, and consequently, that is why a presidential veto can be so strong. If the bill is vetoed by the president, chances are it's dead. So all that work that a member of Congress put into creating and crafting a good piece of legislation that he or she wanted to help their constituents or help the country as a whole, all of a sudden now has been, bashed on the rocks of despair because it never, either saw the light of day in the committee, out of the committee, or out of the floor, or they couldn't agree on the modification. Both houses couldn't agree on the modification and the amendments and the riders that are changed to it, or the president ended up vetoing it. Okay, so again, if they are fortunate and the bill is overridden by both houses of Congress, then the bill will become law. But more often than not, the bill ends up dying. So as you can see, the bill, the whole process of enacting a piece of legislation or a bill into law is a very, very difficult process. And this is why many more bills are introduced than ever get passed. And the likelihood of any one particular one getting passed is very, very small indeed. And so it's as important of the work it is for Congress to do this. Again, the chances of them, it's not, as you can see here, it's not a very efficient way of passing legislation. Our founding fathers deliberately designed it this way to make sure that the laws are so important. We want to make sure that we have plenty of opportunity for compromise, for debate, for consideration, to make sure that we do pass the best piece of legislation as possible. And by the way, this goes back to probably a story you heard back in civics about the fact that you're having a bicameral legislation where you have both the Senate and the House are working on these bills why does it have to go through both the houses of Congress? Why do you want to have a bicameral legislature? And of course, the story with George Washington talking to one of his colleagues, and I forgot the specifics, whether he was talking to Thomas Jefferson or someone else. But the idea is he was sipping tea from his cup, but the way they would do it is pour it into the saucer and then let it cool and then drink the tea from the saucer. And when asked President Washington why a two-house Congress, he says just in the same way, that two houses represents that cooling down period. So basically, why do we need to have a Senate as opposed to just a House? Having the opportunity for a bill to cool down if there are a lot of inflamed passions about something going on. Like the saucer, it gives it a chance, having a bill go to a second house gives it a chance to cool down those passions to make sure that we end up making better legislation. But in any case, I want you to understand the process of passing legislation is very, very inefficient, deliberately designed to be inefficient, to be a slow process. All right? But the idea was that would better make sure that bad bills would not make it through very, very quickly and become law. Now, since we're talking about bills and legislation, let's talk a little bit about how members of Congress vote. Okay, now, obviously there's a lot of similarity between how you vote for a member of Congress and then how a member of Congress votes for particular pieces of legislation. But let's just talk about some of these factors here. If it's a very, very important issue, all right, and your constituents feel very, very strongly about this, and particularly if you're a member of the House of Representatives, you're going to vote the way your constituents feel naturally, all right? On the other hand, if there is a piece of legislation that arouses deep passions among your voters back home, such as, for example, abortion, and let's say, for example, if your constituency is split on how they feel about this, all right, you're going to be in trouble. It's much better if a majority of your constituents clearly favor one position or the other and you vote that way. But if your constituency is divided, then you're in trouble because no matter how you vote, it can come back and haunt you. And I have seen instances, for example, members of Congress are out of town when some of these controversial matters come up for a vote, so they're not actually voting on some of these things to avoid the controversy. But you can better believe that your opponent will look at your voting record and try to use your voting record as a way to bring it up against you in terms of when you're running for re-election. On other issues, however, that are less salient, maybe less important to your constituency, or where there's really not a clear-cut understanding of how your constituents feel, such as maybe an issue about foreign policy, and there's not a clear-cut correlation between the constituent, what they want, then there's cases like this where it's more remote from them, then you're not going to be obviously worrying about your constituents as much, obviously, as you would, and you'll be looking at other kinds of cues to help you do this. So on other issues like this, where you're not really, your constituents don't feel quite so strongly about this, then what will you do? How will you vote instead? Well, you'll vote according to your party. If your party leadership has expressed a particular interest, you'll do that, or by colleagues in the same party that you trust. All right. So let me just give you an example of that. Suppose that you are a Republican representative from Missouri, and you're going to be voting to authorize a new weapons system. Well, you don't know maybe a whole lot about this new weapons system. You haven't researched. You're not on the House Armed Services Committee, and so you don't know that much about this particular issue. Your constituents know even less. There's probably no obvious liberal or conservative position on the matter, so you really can't use your party as strong, your party identification is strong of a guide. So how do you vote on something like this, a new weapons system? Well, what you'll probably end up doing is take your cue from several Republicans, if you're a Republican, from several Republicans on the House Armed Services Committee that handled the bill. How did they vote on this bill? Okay, and if they agree together on this and they have pretty solid views on this, then you will vote along their lines. You'll take their cue from them. If they disagree, however, then you will vote with the one who is mostly closely aligned with your own political ideology. Was it a moderate Republican that you're agreeing with, or a conservative Republican you're agreeing with? Okay, and of course, if the matter is one that affects your state, then you take your cue from members of your state's delegation to Congress, other representatives from Missouri. How did they vote on these bills? All right, and then of course, your own conception of the public interest. What do you think is good in terms of what's best for America? So there are a lot of little factors, a lot of different factors that influence how you would vote as a member of Congress. Obviously the voters, your party, your own conception of the public interest. Remember that trustee role we talked about in the last session. Okay, your own conception of the public interest. Certainly political action committees. How do political action committees feel on a particular issue? Okay, and interest groups along that line. Leadership, the party leadership. How do the leaders of the party that you're a member of, how do they feel about this particular issue or bill? Certainly your colleagues, especially those who played a key role. And last but not necessarily least, your staff, people who are working for you, who are doing research on these issues, who are your eyes and ears, will be giving you some recommendations, and so you'll be also asking them about their views about the merits, the advantages and disadvantages of a particular piece of legislation. So you've got a lot of different factors that influence how you vote. Now, since we're talking about congressional staffs and staff members, I do want to shift a little bit and talk about their increasingly important role in shaping what Congress does. As we alluded to back in our last session, we pointed out that one of the advantages of incumbency is that you have a lot of people who work for you who help you look good and help you get, in a lot of ways, get reelected. These are one of the advantages of incumbency. Each member of Congress has their own personal staff. They answer mail, they do research on policy issues, they write position papers, they help draft legislation, they prepare briefs on pending legislation to help you know what the legislation is all about. They conduct meetings with interest groups. I was talking about in our discussion about interest groups, how a lot of times interest groups will actually meet with your staff as opposed to meet with a member of Congress. They will write speeches. So they do a lot of different kinds of things for you. They'll interface with the media, okay, and write press releases for you on your behalf as well. Now, roughly 80% of the job of if you happen to work for a member of Congress is to answer mail. And again, this is a very elaborate kind of process, and it's a very mechanized kind of process. And I will talk to you in just a few minutes about how this works. But someone may write in who is against abortion, and they'll urge you as a member of Congress to vote against abortion. Someone might write in who is for abortion and urge you to vote for it. All right. Now, what this basically means is that what you will do is, as a member of Congress, you will have a whole list of issues. In fact, let's pretend for a moment. Let's say that you actually came to come work for me and I'm a member of Congress. Your first day on the job here in Washington is you're going to have a book, a large notebook that's tabbed that has all the different issues that we have corresponded to members of our constituents before, ranging from A to Z, all the way from abortion to something about zoos in my district, or funding for zoos, who knows. But there's all of these different issues, and what there is boilerplate language, canned paragraphs that basically explain my position. Over time, my staff members have developed and refined the language that you see in these boilerplate paragraphs. So it's defense, it could be energy, it could be the economy, it could be the environment, whatever it may be. So you see, for example, then you get a letter from a member of one of our constituents. You get a letter and asking us what's my, urging me to vote a certain way regarding energy policy. Cap and trade, for example, is an important topic these days right now. I will have some canned language about energy policy. Your role as a member of my staff is not to write the letter on my behalf and try to figure out what I believe, all right, based upon what you know about me, but instead to take this canned language. Now let's say that member of Congress has actually that constituent has written about several issues, defense, energy, and the environment. Well, you look at the canned language under D, defense, and you'll see some of the most recent updated boilerplate language about maybe some defense authorization bill I sponsored. It may say, as you know, I'm a very strong supporter of of defense. For example, on such and such day, I was a sponsor of the following piece of legislation. And then you go to E for environment and energy, and you'll see specific canned language about, in terms of your concern about the environment. As you know, here's how I feel about the environment. Here's how I feel about the energy legislation. So in any case, what you are doing as a staff person is basically pulling together different pieces of canned boilerplate language, these paragraphs, and inserting them in my response. So basically then your role is to take and understand and identify what is the relevant type of language. You can make some modification as necessary with the approval of higher ups on my staff, but again, you're going to stick to the canned language as much as possible. So when you are writing a letter to your member of Congress, I want you to understand something. That member of Congress doesn't have time to personally craft a letter right back to you to explain all your concerns. The letter you get back is basically this canned boilerplate language. And you're going to basically, that tries to address your concerns. And even the signature of, if I'm a member of Congress, my signature here is not even one that I actually put on the letter. It's because I don't have time to sit all day and sign all these literally hundreds of letters going out every day and every week. So instead, what am I doing? What do we have here? We have something called an auto pen. And the auto pen is basically embodies the same kind of technology as those that when you're duplicating a key. The auto pen duplicates my signature. And basically you run the letter that's got the boilerplate language on it, run it through, and the auto pen automatically signs it. That mimics exactly my signature. All right, so then it's very much of a mechanized kind of process. And as part of this, every week when I'm meeting with my staff, I'm saying, what are my people, what are my constituents writing to me about? What are they saying? What are their concerns? And one staff member may say, well, did you know last week we got a lot of letters from senior citizens who are concerned about some pending legislation that might cut back Social Security. And all these letters were basically the same. They were sent obviously by the AARP, one of the interest groups here that was organized in a grassroots effort to get their members to write, get their members of the AARP to write their respective members of Congress. And so last week, you, that is me here, got maybe 2,000 letters from constituents or 5,000 letters from constituents regarding Social Security. But again, by talking to my staff, they are my eyes and my ears, and they're basically helping me to understand what are the concerns of my constituents. And I get a briefing from them every week. Now, that's about 80% of the job of staff people. But a lot of the other work they do, about 20% of the time, is to engage in that term I told you before called, in the last session, called casework. Casework is specifically helping to solve constituent problems. All right, and a lot of people who did there's a staff assigned to casework in Washington, D.C., as also a lot of the local staff people in your district offices perform casework kinds of functions. That's the idea, for example, helping to get your Social Security your passport expedited would be an example of that. If you're having problems with your Social Security check or something like that, they can help you either at the local level or the national level. There are all kinds of things that may happen, though, that provide the need for staff people to interface with federal agencies such as the IRS or Social Security Administration to help solve constituent problems. I'll give you an example. When I was working as a staff person doing casework for my senator from Georgia, I remember, just to give you an example here, a lady writing a letter to Sam Nunn. Now remember, I told you about Sam Nunn as being an expert on defense policy. And this was an old widow. She had a son named Johnny, and Johnny was in the military. And Johnny decided after he joined to go AWOL. This is a true story. AWOL, A-W-O-L, absent without leave. And he was found by the military police, rounded up and thrown in jail. You can't go AWOL. Well, I got this letter written to Sam Nunn, basically from Johnny's mother, this widow. And she was saying, Dear Senator Nunn, I need your help desperately. My son Johnny is in jail. And in fact, I am attaching a letter. I just received this today from Johnny when he wrote a letter to me talking about how horrible the conditions were in the jail. He talked about the idea that he was taking a shower and there were cockroaches around his feet and the food was just terrible and he's just miserable. And as I read that letter from my son Johnny, tears came down my eyes. And I was just so upset about Johnny. And I just thought, well, we've got to get Johnny out of jail. He didn't mean to go AWOL, Senator Nunn. And I think if anybody can help help get Johnny out of jail, I know you can, Senator Nunn. So please help. So we get this letter, and we're looking at this, and we're saying, oh, okay, well, basically, the first thing we do is craft a letter back to Johnny's mom. And we say, dear Johnny's mom, thank you for your letter dated such and such regarding Johnny and Johnny being in jail and Johnny going AWOL. Here's what we are doing right now. As we speak, we are sending this information to the Pentagon, and we are inquiring from the Pentagon what the situation is. And please be aware, Johnny's mom, that we will be monitoring the situation very, very closely, and we will keep you updated on the status of this situation. In the meantime, if there's anything else we can do for you, please let us know. So Johnny's mom gets that letter saying Senator Nunn is on the case looking after her interest. That letter actually goes to the Pentagon, or there may be a phone call that takes place between a staff person like me working for the senator with a staff person over in the Pentagon. They have what's called an Office of Congressional Affairs. An Office of Congressional Affairs, all the agencies have these. An Office of Congressional Affairs basically interfaces with members of Congress and staff members to deal with these very, very specific kinds of situations. So I may be talking on the phone with another staff person over in the Pentagon, or I may just simply craft this letter and send it over to the Pentagon, and it comes to the Office of Congressional Affairs with Senator Sam Nunn's name on it and an attachment with Johnny's mom and the original letter from Johnny. They will look into this, and then they will get back to us, and they may actually send us a formal response that we in turn then send to Johnny's mom. And the formal response may basically say something like, yes, Johnny's in jail because Johnny went AWOL, and that's just the way it is. And then we'll send back a letter to Johnny's mom, say, dear Johnny's mom, please find attached the response that we received from the Pentagon regarding your son's situation. Please understand that we will continue to monitor the situation actively. If there's anything that we can do, please let us know. And that's how this goes. So much of the work of staff people actually involves is casework just like this. We might get other kinds of things in there. A woman writes in and says that her husband was mistreated by the military or discharged inappropriately. He had received a dishonorable discharge and should have been an honorable discharge. Please help. A husband dies and the widow doesn't get Social Security like she's supposed to. Please help. A person wants help getting into the Naval Academy and wants a letter of recommendation. Please help. You get all kinds of letters coming in from constituents who are asking for the senators or the representatives' help. And by the way, if you ever want to impress your friends and neighbors and relatives, and you want to get by getting a signed picture from your member of Congress, just write them a letter and ask for it, because these staff people are all the more happy. And they'll say, have your name on it and say, to my friend, to my supporter, such and such, with best wishes, Senator Sam Nunn. Okay? These are the kinds of things that staff people do. And again, they may work in Washington or they may work at the local home office. Now, besides your personal staff, you also have staff associated with committees. Again, remember the standing committees like the Senate Armed Services Committees? Now, the people who work, the staff that you have assigned to these committees are more of your policy experts. These are not going to be doing casework and answering letters like this, but these are the people who are going to be drafting the legislation, who are experts in matters of that area, such as defense. And so they will tend to be working more on these policy issues and drafting legislation, attending committee hearings that are going on, deliberations of legislation that deals with that particular policy area, conducting research and helping the member of Congress add or insert or relevant information to that bill to make it a better bill. All right. These members, committee members, staff committee members, keep the senator or representative informed about the issues, okay? They often know more about the issues than you do. So for example, at my staff meeting, I may ask somebody who's an expert on the banking industry. I'm saying, what's going on in terms of this banking bill being considered in Congress right now? And they will tell me at any point in time where it is in the process. Is it still in committee? I'll ask them, okay, now that it's reached the floor, should I vote or not vote for this bill? What are the advantages and disadvantages of the bill? And what are the potential impact on my constituents even in this district? So again, these committee staff people can be my eyes and ears as they pertain to specific legislation. And they help me to tell me to help influence my vote. How do I vote? Why should I vote this way and why? The staff people who work for Congress have increased tremendously over the past 30 or 40 years. I mean, even today they number over 20,000. If you were to take all the staff members who work in all the 435 districts across our country, if you take all the ones who work in Washington, and then all the ones who work for some other institutional parts of Congress that we're going to talk about, the Government Accountability Office, the Congressional Budget Office, and the Congressional Research Service, all of those number about 20,000. It's almost that they have their own separate bureaucracy in a sense. All right? So they have increased, their roles increased tremendously, their numbers and size have increased tremendously over the past 20 years, 30 or 40 years. Now, before we finish talking about staff, I want to talk about one other thing real quickly too, and that is there are, in addition to personnel staff and staff associated with committees, there are also 3 agencies that work for Congress. And these are the Congressional Research Service. This is part of the Library of Congress, which employs a little over 1,000 people. And they do research. The Congressional Research Service actually helps you do research on legislation. It is amazing because what you can do is, as a member of Congress, you can actually ask the Congressional Research Service to basically pull up all prior legislation on something like export controls and research the issue, provide all the relevant research background to give you a summary. So if you're a new committee member, you've been assigned to a new committee, you've been newly elected, and you want some help in terms of developing and shoring up your expertise in a particular policy area, all you need to do is send a phone call or email to the Congressional Research Service, tell them what you want, and probably the next 2 or 3 days later, you may have on your desk a stack of reports produced by the Congressional Research Service that pertain to that particular policy area. All right? So they help you become more involved and more informed on a particular policy area. You also have the Congress, a second staff agency is called the Government Accountability Office. They have headquarters in Washington, but they also have district offices all across the United States. There are over 5,000 people who work for the Government Accountability Office. This is the GAO. The GAO actually is sort of the investigative arm for Congress. If a member of Congress hears about something, let's say, for example, the member of Congress hears about maybe some kind of procurement improprieties going on at the Department of Defense. Let's say, for example, maybe in Iraq or just in general in the Defense Department, there may be some weapon systems that are getting approved that haven't really been tested appropriately, or that have the results have been fudged. And somebody may have blown the whistle in the Defense Department, or somebody may have leaked this to the media, but you've heard about something going on, some kind of scandal going on in one of the agencies in the federal government. Well, the Government Accountability Office will send a team of investigators to investigate that particular issue. They'll look at, for example, financial management or alleged mismanagement going on in a whole variety of all the federal government does, all the different agencies. And they will look at, and write reports after they conduct their investigations. The purpose of the GAO is to root out waste, fraud, and abuse in federal programs and the spending of federal programs. And so, but they work for Congress. The GAO works for Congress. And basically, it will write a report detailing their findings to Congress or to the member of Congress who requested the report and the action. And then from that, Congress and the GAO will basically try to hold the agency accountable for its action by saying, okay, what are you doing to address these kinds of issues? In a lot of ways, it's like performing an audit function where the GAO is actually auditing a particular program or an agency or a department as a whole. Okay, and if there are myriads of programs and policies, and it's investigating and analyzing these policies and programs, making sure that these programs are effective, making sure that the money as it was spent appropriately. There may have been a grant program, making sure that money had the right appropriate financial controls to track the money and how it was spent and make sure it was spent appropriately. These are the kinds of things that the GAO does. It's that watchdog investigative role that helps Congress ensure accountability in the federal government. Okay. Now, besides that, let me give you a third staff agency, and this is the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. The Congressional Budget Office helps to assist the Congress in its analysis of the President's budget. Every year, the President is required to send to Congress in January the budget for the following fiscal year. And that budget involves trillions of dollars and thousands of pages. And Congress has a point and an opportunity to work on the budget every year too, but then the CBO basically has an opportunity to help Congress in terms of analyzing the budget that's submitted by the President, because that budget, it will be marked up by Congress between the January and the following September, because by October 1st the new fiscal year becomes in effect. So it's looking at that next fiscal year. So from January through the end of September, Congress is analyzing the President's budget, and the CBO assists Congress in that process. The CBO is able to provide Congress detailed projections of what the economy is likely to be and various types of initiatives that are embodied in the President's budget to see whether or not they're going to have a positive impact on the economy or what might be some potential negative impacts, whether some of the initial economic assumptions that are built into the budget are accurate or not. So when the President's budget is suggesting a deficit of so many millions or billions or trillions of dollars, the CBO is able to provide an independent verification of those estimates. So in a lot of ways, if you think about this, the CBO plays the same kind of role to helping Congress in budgetary matters as something called the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, assists the President. So CBO is to Congress as OMB is to the President. We'll be talking about the Office of Management and Budget and the Presidency later on down the road. But that's again a very important institutional bureaucratic counterpart to the OMB to make sure that the estimates and the information contained in the budgetary projections are accurate as possible. And so again, those three main staff agencies are very important: the CRS, the GAO, and the CBO. Okay. Now, there are a couple of other issues I want to be talking about in our next session. This is probably a good stopping point. But in our next session, we're going to be talking about the idea about Congress, how voting within Congress and the dynamics that influence individual members of Congress can actually be bad for Congress as a whole in terms of what it does. And then the other thing I want to talk about are term limits. Some detailed discussion about the pros and cons of term limits. Do we need term limits in Congress? Why or why not? And then, in addition to that, I also want to talk a little bit about the Missouri legislature as well. Okay, so our last section will have a discussion, and then once we do that, we'll be finished with this section on Congress. So, until then, this is Patrick Scott. We'll see you next time.